thank you very much, Naveen, and thank you NSI and the Sociology Department for inviting us to speak on this issue. There are many issues which are highly complicated. We have to look at both sides of the issue. But there are certain few issues that are not in the least complicated, where the division between the victims and the victimizers, between the oppressor and the oppressed, between the brutalizers and the brutalized is clear-cut and simple. That doesn't mean that there will not be people or governments that will try to complicate the issue by talking about two sides and all. But there are certain issues on which this does not apply. Vietnam, who was right and wrong, apartheid in South Africa, and the question of what is happening to the Palestinians. This does not mean that you cannot criticize the leadership on the side that are the victims. This does not mean that you cannot criticize their actions. You can. But it means that you recognize clearly that one side are the victims with whom we must align ourselves, and the others are the oppressors and brutal oppressors. Why do I say this? As I said, lots of governments and people will, of course, try and rationalize it's very complicated and so on. Let's take an issue which is absolutely clear-cut historically. The question of apartheid regime in South Africa. Please note that any number of democratic governments supported the apartheid government of South Africa. North America, the United States, the European democracies, they supported it. Many of them also had defense agreements with South Africa. Correct? What do we see today? Any number of democracies, United States, Europe, and one other democracy, what's the name? India, right? Has alliances and recognition of Israel. Those democracies, when they talked about South Africa, said that it's very complicated, there are two sides to the story and so on. What do we hear today? The same thing about Israel. Israel and South Africa are very similar in that both are apartheid states, which of course do not have equal rights for citizens. I'll come to that later on, but you please note that. What did the democracies say about South Africa apartheid? Well, it's bad, we know that they are suffering by blacks and so on. But it's a very complicated story. After all, you must understand that South Africa is a democracy. Look at all the other black African countries that are in Africa. It's much better than that. What do you hear today? You hear that look at Israel. It's a democracy. You have all kinds of dictatorships and others that are taking place around them in the Arab world. What else do they say? Well, Margaret Thatcher said Nelson Mandela is a terrorist. And in fact, the ANC, which believed in armed struggle, the armed wing of it, is a terrorist organization. What do you hear today? You hear, of course, that Hamas is a terrorist organization. So you please note that. Once upon a time, of course, India refused to recognize and was opposed to apartheid. Things have changed. If you want to understand this, then we should be going historically to understand the history. But what I'm going to do is the reverse. I'm going to start off with the existing crisis, then go on to take up the question of Hamas, the Indian position, and only towards the end talk about the history, which of course is very, very important to understand. And I'm sure both Urudamji and Nitya will also be talking about that. Let's take this crisis. This crisis is supposed to have started with the killing of 3 Israelis in the West Bank. Please note first of all that those 3 Israelis are living in completely illegal settlements in the West Bank. That doesn't mean that we should not be opposed or condemn the fact that they were kidnapped and killed. Of course, as I said, we can always criticize even those that we support. We can support the war against colonialism by Indians, but that doesn't mean that you can't criticize or even condemn certain acts and so on. Anyway, however, thousands of Israelis living in the illegal settlements of West Bank have been stealing land, kidnapping, attacking, brutalizing Palestinians, and thousands of them have got away with it. That is a part of actual history. This is an illegal settlement which in fact controls 85% of the water in the West Bank. which is diverted to the settlements there, the Israeli settlements, as well as to Israel. So that, in fact, Palestinians only get 1/6 of the water, and that's also controlled by the Israelis. So that is there. When they were kidnapped, the Israeli government straight away said, without any evidence whatsoever, Hamas is responsible for it. To this day, they have not produced any evidence that Hamas is responsible for it, even though Hamas denied it. Why did they do that? They did that deliberately because they wanted to focus on Hamas. Why did they do that? Because they want to weaken Hamas, not destroy it, weaken it, and of course to prevent the unity talks that were going on earlier between Hamas and Fatah to move anywhere. What does the Israeli government, the United States government, the Indian government, and many others say? Incidentally, when I gave you the example of South Africa, please also note that not just many governments, but many journalists of the democracies, many strategic experts, many bureaucrats, many politicians always rationalize their government's position vis-a-vis apartheid South Africa by saying, you must understand that we have to protect national security, national interest, and all that. And of course, you would have noted on the television, in the papers, etc., you would have noted that very, many people who come on television, experts and so on, say the same damn thing, right? We can come to that later on. We'll take up this whole issue of national interest, national security. So, they did it. Immediately after that, blaming Hamas, they in fact re-imprisoned a number of prisoners, a whole range of prisoners who had actually been released as part of an exchange swap when Gilad Shalit, an Israeli soldier, had been captured. And they released them, they immediately re-imprisoned them. And they said that Hamas has not been prepared to abide by a truce which was brokered by the Egyptians and by the Israelis without the Hamas representatives being present. You don't have to be a supporter of Hamas's social program. Obviously, you can have your criticisms, but one must understand the context, the larger context in which this has emerged. And because Hamas, which is not a party to that truce, obviously rejected the truce, that became the justification for them to, of course, attack Gaza. The Israelis say, and you will find in the Indian media, of course, that there are two sides to the same story. After all, Israel also has to carry out self-defense. Of course, it is disproportionate. When we had in 2009 the attack on Mavi Marmara, an act of international piracy in international waters, the Indian media, including the newspaper, said, oh, it's disproportionate, it's disproportionate. The issue is not disproportionate. Please understand that the West Bank and Gaza constitute the longest running illegal military occupation of the last 150 years. This has taken place since 1967, 47 years. In the last 150 years, there has been no other example. This is the longest running illegal military occupation of a territory sustained by forms of overt and covert violence. That's what it is. What does that mean? It means that those who are suffering under illegal occupation have the right to use force against their oppressors. What they do not have the right, of course, because of humanitarian principles of law, is to target or attack civilians, but they have the right to use force. Whether strategically it is sensible or not, that's a separate question. They have the right. However, the country which is an oppressor cannot argue that in its self-defense it has the right to attack a population or a territory which it is illegally occupied. This is a matter of international law. When Israel says that they are acting in self-defense, or when you find Indians who are saying that they are acting in self-defense, although very disproportionate, etc., this is bullshit. This is absolutely incorrect. However, Hamas and Palestinians are acting in self-defense. Whether you agree with what they should be doing or not doing is a separate question. So this claim that they are doing it in self-defense is completely wrong. What does the Israeli government say about this? Well, it's not an occupation. We're not in Gaza. And of course, this is sanctioned by Israeli law, which Israeli law says, no, there's no occupation of Gaza. But then don't be surprised, because Israeli law says that Hamas is an enemy, you're entitled to do anything. Perhaps you know or don't know that Israel judicially sanctions torture. This was rampant up to 1999, and then after 1999 there was a revision, but they still continue to have torture in what they call extreme circumstances, which means that they are regularly used here. Israel is not a signatory to the Convention on Torture, Cruel and Inhuman and Degrading Treatment and Punishment. Israel is not a signatory to that. There is another country which is also not a signatory to that. It's India. Don't laugh. This is the character of our Indian elite in our Indian society. Understand that? That's something which is common that they have. Israel, China, India and the United States also don't want to be part of the International Criminal Court. We leave that aside. They are also not signatories to the Landmine Treaty. But anyway, all that. Which is the country in the world which has the largest number of political prisoners? China. Absolute numbers, not proportion. In proportion, the prison population of the United States is of course the biggest. 58% of blacks and Latinos. That's another issue. The absolute number of political prisoners, the country that has the largest number is Israel. Israel judiciary has what is called administrative detention. Administrative detention means you do not have to give any reasons for whom you are detaining. They don't have the right to plead against it. All that the detainers have to do, that is to say the Israeli government has to do, is to say that they are a threat, not even to national security, to public security. They can be detained for 6 months. And then of course after 6 months you can give the same reason and you can detain them for another 6 months and go on and on. And that in fact is what Israel is doing. Ask yourself, why is it? Although you represent or are part of the Indian elite, this doesn't come out in the Indian media. Why not? But let's go further. Self-defense? Not this. What was the purpose? The purpose, as I said earlier, was to weaken this thing. Yeah. They say that they have to attack the tunnels. Oh, sorry, let me talk about the occupation. In law, this has been confirmed by the International Court of Justice as well as various organs of the UN. You are in occupation if that part or that entity which you are occupying does not have what is called effective control of its own territory. Effective control applies to the seas as well as the air. As you know, Israel controls the airspace, it has blockaded it. And therefore, in international law, it is guilty of blockading it. In 2005, after Sharon in 2003, they evacuated 8,000 settlers who had occupied 1/3 of Gaza. This was called a step towards reconciliation, a step of evacuation or reduction of the occupation. Completely wrong. It was a rearrangement of the occupation. In the same period that 8,000 plus settlers were taken out of Gaza, the Israelis sent 14,500 settlers into the West Bank. Not only did they do that, the removal of the Israelis from there meant that they could now encircle and make Gaza and make it the world's largest open-air prison. It is blockaded, no airspace control, it has an electric fence, and there are 2 minor crossings in Israel for parting of goods and some people, very limited, and there is the Rafah crossing, which is connected to Egypt. Which Egypt, the second largest supporter, largest recipient of US aid, military aid, Ukraine is now the 4th. Here has of course always played along with Israel. Even after the Arab uprising and the new government that came into place, for a brief period they released Rafah crossing, but the army was always in control and therefore immediately reduced it. What does that mean? It means that for the Gazans, of which 58% or 52% are unemployed, all 38% are employed, 52%, all kinds of problems where it's there. They actually have to rely on those tunnels that they have built for construction material, to be able to maintain their power, for all kinds of building that is necessary, for food, yes, and for weapons, because they have the right to defend themselves which has become clear after Israel has also carried out an invasion. What does the Israeli government say? We must go in and destroy their tunnels, this is wrong, this, that. What does the rest of the world say? Yes, we have to understand. Of course, it's terrible that so many civilians are being killed, so on. As if they don't have the right to use that. And they have had to use those tunnels because, of course, that is deprived. One of the things that could eliminate was, of course, if Egypt lets free flow of people and goods in Rafah with the Lord. In 2009, you had a number of Indians and others who went on the Mavi Marmara, which is, of course, a ship that wanted to end the blockade and which is, of course, attacked in waters. Here. Incidentally, as far as the waters are concerned over here, according to the Oslo Accords, they are supposed to allow Gaza fisherfolk to be able to fish in those seas which are part of Gaza's territorial waters. What in fact the Israeli government has done after the Hamas came into power has reduced that space to only 15% of what they themselves were committed to with regard to the Oslo Accords. Leave that aside. Why did the truce not take place? What did Hamas say? Hamas said, how can you have a truce without us being present? And how can you have a truce as if nothing has happened? And we don't even have the lifting of the siege. In December 2012, the Israeli government agreed that they will reduce the blockade. They will ease the blockade, they'll take steps. Of course, they will take on it. In the context of all this that's happened, what is very, very interesting, of course, is that the Fatah regime of Abbas has also been prepared to play along with the Israelis until very recently today. Now they're saying that we must accept some of the conditions of Gaza. What are the conditions given this blockade? Ask yourself once again, why is it that although this has appeared in Marib, which is a newspaper in Israel, and has appeared on the Jerusalem Post, and has appeared in other countries, Malaysia and elsewhere, why has it not appeared in the Indian media? Well, it's not likely to appear on Arnab Goswami's Raven Bank show, that's for sure. Right? And it doesn't appear on Barka Dutt's this thing here, and it doesn't appear in any of the mainstream media. What are the conditions that Hamas said immediately after the three people, the three Israelis were kidnapped and killed? They said here. Not only Hamas, but Islamic Jihad has said, we are offering a 10-year truce. The rockets, in fact, which were fired, first the whole history was to deliberately provoke the Israelis. When Hamas, when Hamas used rockets, that became the legitimation for carrying out the ground invasion as well as the air attacks and so on. They said, we are offering you a 10-year truce. These are our demands. That the Israeli Defense Force, the Israeli army, move their tanks further from Gaza border defense to a distance that enables Gaza farmers to access their fields and tend them freely. Israel must free all Palestinian prisoners detained after the abduction and the killing of the three Israeli teenagers in southern West Bank, including those who were freed as part of the Gilad Shalit prisoner swap. This precondition also includes softening procedures against all prisoners in Israeli custody. Third, ending the crippling siege on the coastal enclave, which means reopening all border crossings and allowing the entry of construction materials and all requirements needed to run Gaza Strip's power station. 4. Establish an international airport and international seaport in Gaza under UN control. 5. Expand the Palestinian fishing zone to 10 nautical miles and allow Gaza fishermen to use larger fishing ships. 6. Rafah crossing between Egypt and the Gaza Strip should be monitored by international crews from friendly and Arab countries. 7. Israel cannot intervene in the Palestinian Unity Government, including political arrangements and the reconciliation agreement and all its consequences. 8. Israel must give Gaza residents permission to visit Jerusalem and pray in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. 9. Israel must commit to a ceasefire for 10 years, which includes closing Gaza airspace to Israeli aircraft. 10. Gaza industrial zone must be re-established. For the people under blockade, these are the demands, the conditions. They are saying, don't tell us to simply have a truce and leave you what you've done here and continue with the siege when you have reneged on what you were supposed to do in 2012. And it doesn't come in the papers. It doesn't come in the media. You don't have all that. Let's come here. What happened? In 2006, Hamas won the elections which the Palestine Liberation Organization, which is comprised of a number of bodies, had, which marks a distinction from many of the other Arab countries in which you do not have elections. Hamas won 74 out of 132 seats. They were the majority, and they should have fought, replacing Abu Mazen, Abbas, and the PLO. Why did the Palestinians support Hamas? Not particularly, not so much because they have a social program which is backward or reactionary, but because of the betrayal and the ineptitude of the Fatah government, and for other reasons in terms of also providing some support, welfare support and elsewhere, but essentially disillusionment with the disaster that the Fatah government has been. This is something that I'll come to later on here. What happened after that? Although it was democratically elected and entitled to rule, the United States, Fatah, Israel, backed by the Europeans, all said nothing doing, we won't allow it. And then of course after that a whole series of events took place, and of course they remained controlled in Gaza, Fatah took control of the West Bank. Now, as a result of various pressures and all kinds of problems and so on, Fatah and the Hamas are coming together, something that for all the differences among the Palestinians and all, they feel that this is a step forward. At least they're coming together. That's a better chance for us to be able to move forward and all. And Israel, of course, does not want this at all. What about the Indian government? Of course, Hamas's rise is intimately related to the fact that historically all secular and nationalist sort of forces, which are secular national forces, have been waylaid and finished off for a variety of reasons. Whether you talk about the Baptists, whether you're talking about the Nasarites, whether you're talking about the decline of the PLO, which has always been, Fatah, which has always been a secular force in many ways, and so on here. One way the Indian government's response. The Indian government's earlier posture was one of support to the Palestinian cause, Gandhi and Nehru. That doesn't alter the fact that Nehru is not so laudable as many of the left in India make out. Yeah? But it was definitely different from what happens really after 1992. When the end of the Cold War, the shift in the PLO, in Yasser Arafat's perspective, in 1964, Yasser Arafat establishes an independent Palestinian voice, which is why he was called Mr. Palestine, because from 1948 to 1964, in fact, the Palestinian struggle was controlled by the Arab countries. And this really emerges as an independent force. And from 1964 till about 1988, they believe that the only way that they can actually liberate themselves is to actually liberate through armed struggle, guerrilla warfare. And incidentally, the proposal of the perspective, the political perspective of the PLO was for an independent secular Palestine. It was not for a two-state solution, it was for the whole of that, but independent and secular. In 1988, Jordan, of course, maybe we'll come to that later. In 1988, they made the decisive shift to say that they're prepared to accept a two-state solution. There's various histories about that. I don't have time to go into that. Yeah. But then, after the end of the Second World, after the end of the Cold War, the Arafat leadership decided that the only way that we can move ahead is to bring in the United States as an honest broker. And of course, the United States has been a profoundly dishonest broker. You had the Oslo Accords in 1993, which Edward Said very perceptively said at that time that this is a disaster, which it was and is a disaster. It divides there. If you like, very quickly, the period from 1967 takeover till 1993 Oslo is the period of direct occupation of that territory. From 1993 to 2003, the arrival of Ariel Sharon is the period of the subcontracting of the occupation. In other words, the occupation is subcontracted to the renamed PLA, Palestine Liberation Authority. In the Oslo Accords, the PLA recognizes the existence of Israel, where Israel exists, but Israel does not recognize a Palestinian statehood. It recognizes the PLA as the authentic representative of the Palestinian people. Khaled Bisham and others have in fact indicated that they're open to a two-state solution. But when they say, what state does Israel want? That's something we can also take up later on the question. Incidentally, if anybody says to you that Israel has a right to exist, the answer is, let me be very clear, the answer is no. Israel does not have a right to exist any more than the USSR has a right to exist. A territory does not have the right to exist. The fundamental principle is not that a territory has a right to exist. Does India today deny self-determination to Kashmir or Nagaland have a right to exist? No. What you have to say is that the people living there have a right to exist. You can make a secondary argument saying that if the Jews in that part of the world have a right to exist, we believe that Israel should be a territory separately. That's a secondary level of argument, not a fundamental one. Because they can also exist in a variety of frameworks. A one-state solution, a confederation, this, that, etc. So be very careful. The USSR did not have a right to exist. So let's be very clear. The people there have a right to exist. But please understand that all kinds of obfuscations, all kinds of terms are used which sound plausible. If you don't think about this carefully. And the period from 2003 onwards has been the period of unilateralism, in which Israel has moved forward and taken more and more and more. In December 2011, Al Jazeera revealed documents, the Palestinian papers, that showed the extent to which the Abu Mazen leadership was prepared to go to sell out the Palestinians. Hamas is not a big deal. One of the great tragedies of the Palestinians is that this remarkable people has never had the kind of leadership that it deserved. It's one of the great tragedies of that. But Hamas represents some kind of a barrier towards the Fatah and others making even further concessions here. Not that the Israelis are on the principle that if you make concessions, we'll do it. Please understand one thing, which is a kind of golden rule of all settlements. Any settlement that will take place has to reflect the existing balance of forces, the existing relationship of forces. It's clear. The existing relationship forces between Israel and the countries that are supporting it and the Palestinians is overwhelmingly in favor of the Israelis. They see absolutely no reason for them to have a settlement here. They can continue more, they can maintain it. The one thing they cannot do, and again I won't go to that, I'm speaking about, let me very quickly, as far as the Indian government is concerned here, a few things here. One is that yes, you then have a shift. That shift actually takes place with the Congress government, which of course has this, and therefore when Sushma Swaraj argued against the Congress and all the rest of it, they were left defensive. What are they going to say? She said, this is what you did. The difference between the two, the BJP regime and them, is that the Congress, for strategic reasons, decided to ally with them. The BJP is not just strategic, there's a deep ideological commitment as well, which gives its own dimension towards it. Anti-Muslim. Actually, Israel has not been anti-Muslim, it's been anti-Palestinian, 10% of Christians. But recently, in the last few years, it's seen the value, given the overall demonization of Muslims and Islam going on this. Now it's trying to view the Palestinian Arabs, the Palestinian Christians in Israel towards their side also. Again, that's a separate issue. But yeah, so this is a commitment here. What is the attitude of the Indian strategic community, Indian elite? Lip service and money to the Palestinians. But our more serious business is strengthening our relationship with Israel and the United States. Let there be some settlement, let it go away, that's fine. But that's basically here. As I said, this regime has an even more emotional and stronger commitment to that particular, the question of relationship. What will the strategic community say? Our national interest. I hope somebody, the audience will ask about this whole business of national interest and national security. Because it presumes, if you like, a socially neutral state, all sorts of other things, etc. But it doesn't alter the fact that all of us have multiple identities, and all of us, even the most cynical of people and the most corrupt of people, have a certain moral sensibility. Which is why it is so important for the Israelis to find rationalization, justification, so they can look at themselves and say, we are being moral. So the Israeli judicial law and all says, no, this is it. If you have 3 people killed, the overwhelming majority of Israelis came out and said, death to the Arabs, this is terrible, etc. But naturally, if you are going to justify that this is, if you are going to justify this longest of the illegal occupation, you have to be morally desensitized and humanized to some particular degree. And this business of Israel being under threat of all this, when are we going to get rid of this myth of the perpetual victimhood of Israel? This is a country with the 4th or 5th largest conventional armed forces in the world. It is by far the strongest armed force conventionally in that region. It has nuclear weapons. It is backed by the most powerful military power in the world, the United States, and it still goes on and on about it being security under threat. And the amazing thing is not that it says this. The amazing thing is that this is actually believed. This is the extraordinary thing about it. In fact, they don't need compulsory conscription. They don't need it. They have a superb professional army. Why do they have compulsory conscription? Because it is a garrison state which wants to cultivate a garrison mentality. It is the ideological, political, emotional aspect of military conversion for you that is so important. So you can sustain this idea among the Israeli public that we are a garrison state surrounded by that, etc. I talked for a bit longer than I expected. Let me just say, very quickly say something about the history of this here. After the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, mandates were given to Israel, to England and France over the whole of this region. Syria, what became Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine. A mandate was an indirect form of rule which meant that we are preparing you